Welcome to Kilburn in North Yorkshire, home to the Mouseman, Robert Mousey Thompson, a famous carpenter, craftsman and furniture maker from the early 20th century, whose work can be found all across the UK and England, particularly here in the north, and who famously signed his work with a mouse. So we're going to be exploring some of his work inside St Mary's Church here and trying to work out why he chose the mouse as his signature. We're going to be looking inside this beautiful historic Norman church, and also in particular at one of the very rare grave slabs in there, which gives us a bit of a clue as to perhaps the inspiration behind one of the most popular characters in Game of Thrones, that of Oberyn Martell, famously played in a TV series by Pedropascal. So my name is Chris, this is Church Searcher, and I'll see you after the map. So the beautiful little village of Kilburn sits right underneath the Hambleton Hills in the shadow of the Kilburn horse, carved into the hillside by locals in 1857 to commemorate the race course that was once on top of the hill there, but also the Hambleton, a type of thoroughbred from this area, a racehorse breed. Now, the place name Kilburn derives from the Old English Anglo-Saxon word burner, which means stream. So the village here is named after the stream, which still to this day runs right through the centre of the village. Now, I always presumed that it was a personal possessive name. So someone, for example, like Killer, this was their land and this was their stream which ran through here. So like a Norse sounding name. But actually, if you look in the Domesday book, you'll see that the original place name here was Kilburn. And Kilburn derives from the Old English Anglo-Saxon word for cold or cool, and the source of this stream is right underneath the Hambleton Hills, and it comes up and runs through the village here, so it's a very cool, cold stream, giving the name Kilburn or Kilburn. So this Norman church was built between 1120 and 1130, and as we go in we'll see beautiful Norman doorway on the entrance, but also the chancel arch inside. It was extended. You can see we'd have added on the northern aisle in 1170, and we'll be looking at the chapel that's in that northern aisle, and the tower dates from 1667. So it's grown and expanded over the years, like a lot of these churches do. Now, if you look in the Domesday book, it mentions the various owners that it's passed through. Arncatil or Archil, it then passed to Hugh, son of Baldric, and then eventually came under the ownership of Rouen Cathedral, but eventually it settled with Roger de Mowbray, and he was a very powerful patron around this area. He was patron of this church, and we'll see some potential evidence of that inside, but also the various monasteries and abbeys around this area. There's Newborough Priory just down the way, which we mentioned in the Byland Abbey ghost stories, which you can see here. Also Byland Abbey itself, which once moved various locations around this area, and he was patron of both of those. So, Robert Mousey Thompson was born in the village here in 1876, and he lived and worked here all his life, right through until he passed away in 1955. And you can see this modest grave marker here where he's buried, next to Geoffrey Cartwright here. The Cartwrights married into the Thompson family, and it's the Cartwright family who still run the Robert Thompson workshop in the village, where they still make traditional oak furniture. Next to that, you've also got John Thompson buried next door with a wooden grave memorial, and on the side of it you actually see a mouse connecting it to the Robert Thompson workshop. Now, Robert Thompson's father was the local joiner and carpenter in the village here, so it's when he passed away that Robert Thompson took on his business as the local wheelwright, cartwright, repairing fences and doors and things like that. But already he was thinking about becoming a master craftsman and furniture maker, and started stockpiling oak. And all around the village to this day you see stockpiles of oak being left out to season. Essentially you're leaving the oak to dry, reduce its moisture content, which gives it time to settle, warp, crack in some cases, and you leave it for about 1 year for every inch of thickness. And so by that time the oak is then good for using to make furniture. So it's around 1911 that Robert Thompson actually started making furniture for locals around the area here. Now when the First World War came along, carpentry was actually a protected profession. He had to stay here using his skills in carpentry, which were very much in demand at the time because obviously a lot of people were going off to fight. So rather than having to go and fight, he was required to stay and work as a carpenter. By the time of the end of the war, in the 1920s, there was a resurgence in interest in the craft industry, inspired by the arts and crafts movement of the late Victorian era and William Morris and such. So his work of hand-hewn oak furniture was very much in demand. So he went from someone who complained about as being as poor as a church mouse to being very, very popular and in demand. And to this day, the oak handmade furniture commands very, very high prices. And you see his work all around the country, in churches, but also in Westminster Abbey, York Minster here in the north as well. So we're going to go have a look inside, check out some of his work and some of the beautiful historic architecture inside. So as soon as you come in here, you can see the way the church has been expanded out in this direction with the pointed early medieval arches in comparison to the original Norman curved arches. But it's this beautiful chancel arch here from the Norman period, which has some really beautiful detail in it. And all the pews here in the main body of the church are from the Thompson workshop from the 1970s. So they're not Robert Thompson pews, but they are all carved with the little signature mouse on them. Now the pews were all paid for by public subscription and donations. So you can see there's one dedicated here to the parishioners of Kilburn, but also one to visitors to Kilburn. This one at the front here is in memory of John Leonard Wilson, Bishop of Singapore and Birmingham, passed away 18th of August 1970. So John Leonard Wilson here was born originally in Gateshead. He got a degree in theology at Oxford University and then became Dean of Hong Kong before becoming Bishop of Singapore. And he was there at the fall of Singapore in 1942. He was subsequently put in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, and he was one of 57 civilians who were tortured after several Japanese warships were sunk in the harbour in Singapore while they were trying to find out answers as to how this raid had been perpetrated. Post-war, he was subsequently made Bishop of Birmingham. He eventually retired around 1968 and came up here to Yorkshire, which is where he passed away in 1970. So on the end of all the pews here, we've got these little mice carved in, very finely detailed, little ears, eyes, whiskers as well, and then down the back here, a little tail. So it's said that early in his career, Robert Mousey Thompson complained to one of his colleagues about being as poor as a church mouse, and so they adopted a little church mouse as their emblem. It's also said to represent this notion of quiet work in small places, personified by the workshop here in Kilburn still to this day. Now, Robert Thompson was famous for working in oak purely, and making everything handcrafted as well. So all the pieces in here have been carved by hand, and if you look along some of the pews you can see the adze marks after they've been carved with adze and chisels. Also, no screws or nails used, everything is held together through joinery, joints and little wooden doweling pegs. So at this end of the chancel we've got a fold stool, beautifully carved, and you can see it does actually have Robert Thompson's own mouse carving at the bottom here. However, if you look around the bottom of the base, there's also a crocodile here. That's because this piece was worked upon by Robert Thompson and one of his apprentices, and so they adopted the not so subtle crocodile as their signature. At the other end of the chancel you'll see the font has a cover that's been added on, and that was carved by yet another apprentice, and they've signed their work with a little lizard. So there's all sorts of creatures, great and small, hidden here, alongside more Mousey Thompson work in the rest of the church. So this is the beautiful chancel arch from the original Norman church, built between 1120 and 1130. So this is older than the ruins that we see at Byland, nearby Revo Abbey as well. You can see on this side the columns have been restored, but there's a griffin maybe on the end there. Also an eagle here, perhaps representing John the Evangelist. And on this side there's a haloed angel. But on the opposite side, which is the original columns, we've got this lion. And you do see lions a lot depicted in Norman period Romanesque architecture. Various potential biblical meanings, but in this context it's thought it might actually be representing Robert de Mowbray and the de Mowbray family, the patrons of this church and the abbeys and monasteries around here. The lion was the emblem of the de Mowbray family, so it could be that this is celebrating and commemorating the patron here. And all the way around the top we've got these vine leaves and strands as well, reminding the congregation of Jesus' motto that I am the vine, you are the branches. So it's through the chancel arch, and on this side that we've got this extension that was built in the 1170s and is dedicated to St. Thomas. Now it's on the 29th of December 1170 that Thomas Beckett, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was murdered by a number of knights who fled to Knaresborough Castle to hide out here in Yorkshire. So it's around that time that a lot of chapels were dedicated to St. Thomas. So it's probable that St. Thomas's chapel here is dedicated to Thomas Beckett. Now it's through here that there's two grave slabs which give us this connection to Game of Thrones. So in the little doorway here on either side we've got this pair of grave markers from the 13th century. On this side we've got this pastoral staff of a flabella, beautiful intricate carving around the top there, and this denotes an abbot or someone very high up in a monastery or an abbey, and you can see the flabella here indicating that they're ordained high up. Now around here we've got Byland Abbey, Revo Abbey, and the community at Byland actually moved around several times before settling at Byland under the patronage of Robert de Mowbray. They actually had an abbey not far from here in a place called Hood. So it's possible that this perhaps was one of the abbots from that community. And in the chapter house at Byland there is actually a very similar grave slab there, and it's in that chapter house where one of the monks was said to have risen from the grave and haunted the local community, and you can see that story in the Byland Abbey Ghost Stories video we did earlier in the year. Opposite, however, we've got another grave slab with a beautiful foliated cross. And then next to the cross, there's a shield here. It's this circular carving, but you can tell it's a shield because it's got a boss in the middle there to protect the hand. And then next to that, there's this long-handled weapon. This is an evolution on from the war hammer. It's a pole hammer, a longer version of a pole axe, essentially. Now, war hammers evolved to deal with very efficient plate armour around this time, 13th, 14th centuries, but it became fashionable to use them in trials by combat. And so it's thought that this is actually the grave slab commemorating a champion who fought in trials by combat, particularly for ecclesiastical people who weren't allowed to take part in trials by combat. So when there was a dispute about land or money and things like that, an abbot or a priest was involved, they couldn't get involved. Now, the Normans did introduce ecclesiastical courts as well for the church, but it's thought that this was perhaps the champion, perhaps even for this priest here. Now, the name for this particular weapon here is a Martel, and in Game of Thrones is this character called Oberyn Martell, who fights as a champion on behalf of one of the other characters in Game of Thrones. I won't give away what happens, it's quite a full-on scene. But we know that George R.R. Martin, the author of the Game of Thrones novels and the TV series, took a lot of inspiration from British history, the Wars of the Roses, the Hadrian's Wall, the border wars up there. So it's possible that while researching Game of Thrones, he came across the Martel, the weapon of a champion, and knowing that he had this character who was going to serve as a champion, that he would name him Oberyn Martell after the weapon here. Now, also in St Thomas's Chapel, there's this corn sheaf in the corner here. Now, Kilburn is pretty well known locally for retaining a lot of its old folkloric customs and traditions. Every July there's the grand feast here in the village where they have games and sports throughout the day, finishing up with a cask of ale in the pub. But this is from harvest time. It's known as the Mell. The last corn to be harvested is made into a sheaf like this. It's decorated with ribbons and flowers, and it's brought into the village hall, and dances are performed throughout the evening around it. And so this is the Mell from harvest time. It's been brought in for the harvest festival into the church. Now, this isn't it, but St Mary's Church here in Kilburn also possesses a pretty rare Bible called a Breeches Bible, also known as the Geneva Bible. And these were made between about 1557 and 1560 during the reign of Queen Mary I. She was a Catholic, and it was at that time there was quite violent repression of Protestants all across the country. And so Protestant thinkers and academics ended up escaping out of the country to pursue their own religion to places like Geneva. And it was in Geneva where one of the very earliest English translations of the Bible was performed. And because of the printing press, it meant that this translation could be reproduced and spread around in secret the Protestant communities that were living underground in England. Now, it's called the Breeches Bible because in Genesis, the translation describes Adam and Eve making a pair of breeches out of vine leaves to preserve their modesty. So quite a unique interpretation of the original Latin translation there. So it's amazing really that the church here in Kilburn has a copy of the Breeches Bible locked away for safekeeping. So what a beautiful little historic church this is. St Mary's here in Kilburn, North Yorkshire. From the Mousey Thompson mouse, which are hidden all around the church here, through to the Norman architecture, the grave slabs, right the way through to these beautiful Victorian pews, still with their original candlestick holders and candles. Quite remarkable, really. If you want to help them in preserving this legacy, I've left a link for donations down below and in the description in the text. But until next time, I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, keep church searching.